So Sharon gave a great introduction, and I'll just repeat a little bit of it. But what we have developed over the past couple of years with the Leadership Forum series is a series of programs that are all tied together with a certain theme. We've done the inspirational leader, the mindful leader, and this year it's the strategic leader. And all of these are really tied into our the Crew Leadership and Professional Development Committee mission. And our mission really is to develop your leadership skills. We want to develop you into confident professionals that can drive organizational success so that you can learn and do this in a safe environment and really build those skills, because you may not always be getting that at work. So we want to be able to be that forum for you. So this year, we have a series of 4 programs plus our book club that Sharon noted on the power of habit. And in March, there was a nice introduction to the concept of the strategic leader. And that talked about a series of components of being a strategic leader. And we're going to talk today about strategic thinking. So that's kind of the framework for today's section. And Eric and I will be presenting together. So when you step back and you think about the work environment today is fast and furious. It's more complex than it's ever been before. It requires strategic thinking and not just execution from project to project to project. And so what we want to be able to do is focus on developing that ability to be a strategic thinker so that you can drive organizational success and your own personal success. So let's see. I think I will turn it over to Erica for the goals.
Thank you, Cathy. So our goals for the presentation today, we'd like all of you to begin really developing your strategic thinking ability and build your strategic competence. We're going to provide you with a brief recap of what it means to be a strategic leader. That really will be more about, the workshop that we had, the first one, just recapping on that. We're going to review the key components of strategic thinking, the mindset, as well as the 5 different competencies. And then we're going to break out in 2 different groups, and we're going to put the concepts that you learned today to work. And those are real life scenarios that a lot of us have experienced in our careers or eventually will at some point in time. So without further ado, back to Cathy.
Thank you. And I'd like to also highlight the fact that at your seats, you have a workbook. And the workbook has all the information that Eric and I are going to present and then some. So you can make notes in your workbook and just use it as a resource when you go back to the office. We found that having a workbook can be very effective, and hopefully you'll be able to use that in your day-to-day jobs, as well as whatever you do on the outside, other organizations, for example. So when you think about strategic leadership focuses on the enduring performance potential of the organization over time so that it will thrive and flourish in the years to come. That's what leadership does. In addition, specifically for the teams and individuals that they demonstrate strategic leadership by thinking, acting, and influencing strategically in ways that promote the sustainable and competitive advantage for an organization. So it's that thinking, acting, and influencing. Now, when you look at these 3, well, we call them bubbles, but they're 3 bubbles. Each one is important. And during the course of this year's Leadership Forum series, we're going to talk about thinking today, acting in September, influencing in December. And thinking helps you, we're really trying to build your strategic competence. In acting, it's going to be developing a strategic team. And influencing will be developing your strategic confidence. But each of these are important on their own. But together, they create more than the sum of the parts. So if you think about this as a 3-legged stool, think, act, and influence, each leg is important. But together, they create the stability. And they are really, it's the power of them all coming together under the umbrella of strategic leadership. Strategic thinking, this graphic defines it beautifully, but strategic thinking encompasses both a strategic mindset and strategic competencies. I'll talk about the mindset, and Erica will talk about the competencies. But when you look at this, think about the roots of the tree that really create the limbs and the foliage that flourish and are visible to all to see and enjoy. So, we always like to do, and oftentimes we've done strategic assessments. In your workbook, you'll find on page 7 a strategic assessment tool for you. We're not going to do this today because there isn't time, but we wanted to give you a tool so that you could take an assessment of where you think your strategic skills are. Take it tonight or over the weekend at some point in the future, and then look on page 6 and you'll see some questions that will prompt your thinking about what the implications are for you and what you can do to build your strategic thinking skills. So first step is to really understand where you're coming from and use that personal self-assessment. Secondly, it's very, very important to engage team members and other employees. When you think of strategic leaders, who do you think of that are really a step above everybody else? How about some ideas? Who would you identify as a key strategic leader?
In our organization?
Oh, anywhere. Out in business and industry. Heather.
Angela Merkel.
Angela Merkel, and why is that?
Oh, I think she thinks through every decision she makes, and she thinks how it's going to. Her future sight for every decision that she makes, I think she thinks through. She's very strategic in
Okay.
what she does, what she says, who she works with, why she works with them.
Okay, good thought. Helen.
Steve Jobs.
And why would you say Steve Jobs?
He really had a vision for what people might want and carried that out. So he saw something that people didn't know that they wanted.
And how did he go about doing that? Not that you're an expert on Apple. I understand that. Not suggesting that.
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming that how he went about doing that is he probably spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it was how people worked and how they interacted with each other and how they could interact with each other, and saw opportunities that both he understood the technological piece as well as the human piece.
Okay. Sharon.
Michael Bloomberg.
Okay, tell us why you think of that.
I think he has a very clear set of values that underlies the actions that he takes, and he's not afraid to let those values show through when he takes action.
Okay, these are all great examples. And let's think of some other people too, like Jack Welch from GE, or Walt Disney from Disney Corporation, or
Mark Zuckerberg.
Mark Zuckerberg. Thank you. I was going to say Michael Zuckerberg, and I know that's not right, from Facebook. But one of the things that all of these people do is that they engage employees. They reach out and really sweep them in with an embrace that engages and motivates them. And they use their personal dynamism, if you will, to really create the passion. And they've defined, if you think about each of those people that we've mentioned, they're really defined by their passion. And that comes across, and you really get inspired by it. So they engage their employees or their team members, and they apply not just the analytical and the business approach, but they also embrace them so that they're excited to come to work each day. So the difference between people in an organization just doing their jobs, the people who come in and they just kind of are lackadaisical. They come in, get their paycheck, do their job, go home, and they feel like they're fired upon. But the people who are fired up, that's the team that really is excited, and they get really behind their leaders and want to drive the organization's success. They want to have the organization's success for breakfast every day. They want a new challenge, and that's what sets these guys apart. And it's that personal commitment that they are committed to the organization's success. So the next thing is to really develop the mind of a strategic thinker, or the mindset of a strategic thinker, so that you can then be open to developing the competencies, and it allows the competencies then to flourish in that environment. So when you think strategically, and developing a mindset is really three things. It's a collective process. It's not just about the future. Most people think strategy is all about the future. Well, you can't get to the future unless you know where you are today and what your strengths are and what your priorities are. And then it's both artful and analytical. So once you get that strong foundation that will allow you to then really develop your competencies, you're going to be far more successful. So then we'll think strategically. So when you're developing your mindset, it involves both cognitive and social processes. And it leads to you're leading to a shared understanding, or what sometimes coined common sense, of the complex relationship between the organization and its environment. It involves using that understanding to set the organization for the organization's future. And again, it's not just about the future, but it's about the present. The present is important because you have to understand where you are, what your competitive framework is, and what your strategic priorities are. Priorities are often compared to goals. They're not. Goals are the end result. Priorities help you achieve those goals. And your priorities you set in the present, and they're based upon your present capabilities that can then suggest where you need to go for the future. And let's go back. The other thing that's important, too, is that collective process. And a collective process really means diversity. You need to get input from every level of the organization. It's not just the C-suite or the corner offices that set strategy. You may think it is, and in some corporations, it probably is. But the beauty and the richness of thinking strategically comes from the aggregation of multiple perspectives from different levels in an organization, different functions. Might be finance, might be purchasing, might be business development. All of these coming together to help shape your future. They all come at it from a different angle, and that's the richness. Older, younger, different levels in an organization. Thank you. So one thing that you can do that's really helpful is to broaden your thought process. Now, when you look at these two columns, the left side is definitely more analytical, very business-oriented. The right side is more holistic and creative. Now, when you look at your companies, where do you think most companies fit, or most companies represented in this room? How many of you work for companies where this is really the thought process that exists in your organization, the complementary? Jerry, Red Cross, wonderful. Okay, anybody else? Helen, well.
I'm starting a company that's looking like that.
Okay, so anybody else on the complementary side? Okay, we have two representatives here. Heather.
A little bit, because it's architecture.
Okay, so I would say architecture is a little more creative. Advertising agencies, oftentimes retailers are a little more creative. But how about companies that are represented in the traditional thought process? Okay, now let's see more hands, really. Okay, so everybody that wasn't the three that were noted would be over here. That's typical. It's business focused, and typically most businesses are on that side. But what's really wonderful is when they complement each other, and when you merge the two and you move away from that traditional thinking to think more broadly. So take analyze. If you're not analyzing, the next step to it is synthesizing the analysis. What other analyses come together? What other inputs come together so that you create a richer solution by thinking more broadly? So you don't want to just be one or the other. You want to merge them and try to think broadly about where you want to take your company and your focus. So you'll see the words on the left and the words on the right complement them. And I encourage you to think broadly and use that to create a a result that's more than the sum of the parts. And a good analogy, I love music. I go to the CSO all the time, and I just love it. But when you think about a symphony, there may be 45 instruments in an orchestra. And Beethoven wrote the melody or the lines for each instrument. So each instrument has its own part. When you put it all together, though, it's not individual pieces. It's one whole that works together with the synergy by working with each other and the conductor and music director really making it powerful with the dynamics, with the emotion of it all. So that's really what we're trying to create, is the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So, again, you've got your assessment tool. We engage employees, though. Is what is really helpful. You love to work with people who engage other employees. Make sure you use your head and your heart. It's not just the analysis, it's the qualitative skills that you can bring to it as well. And then to develop the mindset of a strategic thinker. And once you've done that, you set it up for the competencies that Erica will review.
Thank you, Cathy. Now we're going to discuss the 5 competencies, and really the mindset lays the foundation for strategic thinking, but it's the 5 competencies that when they come together, that's what makes a strategic leader, separates a strategic leader from a leader. The first competency that we're going to discuss is scanning. So scanning is really assessing where your organization is at this moment in time. So that could be using, a SWOT analysis. So looking at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats against your competitors. How many of you have conducted a SWOT analysis? Wow, that's great. It's a great way to really see where you're at in regards to those around you. With scanning, you're also, looking into what your competitors are doing, paying attention to the new technologies that come out, staying on top of market reports, just really knowing what's going on in your industry, just so that you can stay ahead of the game. Visioning. That's really when you are envisioning the future for your organization. Where it's at now is scanning, but where your organization can go and what it can become. It's having that sense of vision and dream and hope. The third competency is making common sense, having a shared understanding. So this ties in with visioning. Everyone in the organization needs to have the same vision, the same goal for the organization, where you want it to be. If you have different teams that don't understand what's going on, if the company's being bought, being sold, and there's chatter and assumptions that one person, what they're saying is right, and then there causes fear and chaos. Just having common sense, having a shared understanding, make sure that everyone within your organization is on the same page. So appreciative inquiries are ways that you can reframe questions about what's going on in your organization and really engage your employees. By asking questions in a certain way, it gets different responses. What do you notice about these first questions? Does anyone notice something that kind of stands out? Yes?
Focusing on the negative, focusing on the problem.
Right, exactly. Yeah, what are some of the biggest problems you see in your organization? What seems to be happening when your team fails to reach its potential? Questions like that, the answers that you get, it's the negative, not positive response. When you rephrase the question to more of a positive approach, what are 3 things your organization could do to become even stronger and healthier? That's acknowledging that your organization is strong and healthy, but there is, for a strategic leader, there's room for improvement in the future. What is going on when your team is performing at its very best? You're acknowledging that your team is performing at the best, and there's just room for growth and improvement. So it's negative versus the positive framing of a question.
And I'd just like to add a supplement thought here. We've done our forum series over the past several years, and one of the things we looked at in one of our sessions was now discover your strengths. And the whole concept there was to build from your strengths as opposed to overcoming your weakness. And so that's very much ties into that. So I just encourage you to think about that, build from your strengths, and the appreciative inquiries do that.
Systems thinking, this is when you're not getting bogged down in the details. You're looking for patterns over time. You're watching how is, for instance, the office market, how is that changing, 5 years ago to 10 years? What are the trends that you see? Looking at the big picture instead of just paying attention to, what's going on just right around you. Look at how the future of your organization or industry, how that's going to change over time. The fifth one that we're going to pay a little bit more attention to is reframing, and that's looking at things differently from a new perspective. For instance, commercial office space in Chicago. When people or when companies acquire buildings, you have to convince your asset managers and your investors to put in a lot of capital for the improvements. It's getting them to understand, because a lot of those investors might be from overseas, that the Chicago office market, you're not just selling, or you're not just marketing office space for lease, you're really marketing an entire building, a live, work, play environment. I mean, there's so many competitors, which goes back to scanning, that you have to pay attention to. Who has the new tenant amenity floor and conference center and fitness center, dog park? I mean, it's just really knowing what's going on around you so that you can stay competitive and stay at the cutting edge, so your organization ultimately can succeed and, last longer than your competition. It's also, for instance, Blockbuster. They didn't really pay attention to how the internet was taking off, and with iPods and whatnot, having that portable music, and you're not having to have a CD player or a boombox lugging around. So they didn't pay attention to what was going around, just not only in their industry but other industries around them, and they ultimately failed. Netflix came in, on-demand TV. It's just knowing what's going on around in your organization and in your industry as well as industries around you. So you just have to look at things in a different perspective and how that can impact your organization.
So your examples are really beneficial here. So again, ask, what could we do that will really position us to be the best? Not necessarily how can we grow market share. That's more narrow. What could we really do that will position us most effectively to grow our business in the future? How is that going to change our organization?
Right. In another, you think about like Michigan Avenue, there's the new Apple store that's going in there. And what's kind of crazy is that you're putting in a big retail store at the southern tip of Michigan Avenue, as opposed to, where you've got all of your other major retailers. And they're really, catching on with like London House that's there. You've got the retail of the Wrigley building and how that's all kind of transforming. And then with the Riverwalk and the redevelopments that are going on, that's seeing the big picture and how the future, just changing their perspective of what retail is supposed to be. So as Cathy discussed, the mindset is really the foundation. And when you put together the competencies, and that's what makes strategic thinking. You've got to be, involved and know what's going around you, have a vision, make sure that everyone on your team and within your organization is on the same page and has a shared understanding, and really, just not pay attention to getting into those little details. Just think about it in the big picture. So now we're going to go into one of our first group exercises. So we'd like you to apply the strategic thinking concepts that we discussed earlier with the scanning, visioning, reframing, which you can find actually in your workbook on pages, I think, 16, 17, and address one of these topics. So the first one, two companies with different cultures are merging. How should a division head or team leader approach the situation to optimize outcomes for the new company and or team? Second question, a new building development has been announced that will be a competitive threat to an older existing building. How should the existing building, within that, the organization, the leasing, management, ownership, how should they approach this situation to effectively compete with the new rival? And that also is, with having that shared understanding, they all need to be on the same page. So what we like to do is have this side, you can be question 1, and this side could be question 2. So talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll regroup in about like 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll discuss. So we are going to discuss what we've all talked about. So,
I know it's hard to conclude a discussion.
right. We're glad that you like the topics. So this first group, they had question 1. The two companies with different cultures are merging. How should a division head or team leader approach the situation to optimize outcomes for the new company and or team? So we'll start with you. So,
And then we've got 3 groups here versus 1 group here. So we'll ask the 3 groups over here to be brief, please. Helen, be brief.
Okay. Will do. So one of the things that we talked about was that it's really important for the groups that are merging to understand the strengths of each other. So we were talking about having some kind of visioning workshop where you'd be looking at the strengths and then what would be a vision that would bring everybody together.
Okay, great. What about the other 2 groups? And we can go back and forth, so get other ideas.
Well, we were looking at the tree itself, actually, and this person who is the team leader would have to work with these executives who were looking to merge the 2 companies, as well as with their team members underneath them. And being able to adequately communicate the reasons for the merger and be very sensitive to the soldiers and their feelings about the merger. SWOT's definitely learning the strengths and weaknesses and talents of both companies. How are you going to bring them together? Possibly to find out what the soldiers' desires are or talents are, what they want to develop themselves, and maybe some sort of anonymous survey so you can incorporate that and understand better what your talent structures are to incorporate that into the vision of the company. And then
Great.
just really communicating.
wonderful.
So the art of communication permeates everything, and I think we just always realize that the biggest problems in an organization stem from poor communication. But particularly when you're trying to be a strategic thinker and a strategic leader, communication has to be front and center. How about the table in the back?
Well, I said to myself, the first thing that I would do if I were the team leader division head would be to start meeting with people. We used to call it management by walking around, because until you get to know who's on your team now and what their strengths and weaknesses are, you're not going to know how to blend them together. And then the other thing we talked about was, don't just jettison one person's way of doing things. Look at the way both companies did things to see if you can make it better.
So that's an appreciative inquiry.
Yeah.
Great. Any other thoughts?
I'm not the only one, you guys. So, I mean, one of the things that we talked about was that everybody needs to be involved. So it's not just, so having a merger come from top down is not going to work very well.
So it's a collective process to create that shared understanding.
That's right.
Oh, so I didn't want to stop you, Helen.
No, but you're right. You're right.
I'm just trying to pull out the concepts.
Yes.
Right.
Julie.
We also talked about how so many of these mergers fail and just result in a complete bleeding of the personnel, and that ego gets in the way so often. And it's like, check the ego at the door.
Good point. Jean, you had a comment?
We talked about also, once the vision's established, through all the meetings and management by meetings, repeating it early and often and in different ways so that we see the different ways the vision's incorporated in what we do every day.
All good points. Helen?
It's, one of the things we talked a little bit about is that it may not be, that the vision of the people who are doing the merger, the top guys, or women, whoever, who are creating that, may not actually see the whole picture. And that if they are the only ones who are actually trying to put this thing together, it may not work. And that it really...
And they may miss opportunities.
And they, certainly they'll probably miss opportunities, yeah.
Great. So that's a wonderful response to question 1. Really the richness that comes through and the importance of the competencies to establish your strategic thinking ability. So how about group 2?
Sure, so I'll kick it off, but I'm going to ask the rest of my team, feel free to jump in.
And that's really about having the competitive building development arising and how that impacts your existing building and what you can do about it.
All right, so we spent most of our time focused on the top, but there are several things that came up in discussion on the bottom of the tree around things like the collective process of getting input, also thinking about the present, what is it, what's working well right now, instead of not only envisioning the future, but what do we like about what's existing right now. So we went through kind of the different areas of the competencies up top, and when we think about scanning, looking at what are the strengths of the existing building, not necessarily assuming that there aren't already good things going on in the existing building we want to keep. And then also thinking about, well, what's the new building bringing in that we would like to take a look at and see if that's something we want to offer. Looking at improvements, evaluating the market overall, so looking at what's going on in the current market, and asking our tenants for improvements, so that it's not just a management perspective, but it's also what do the tenants like about the existing building already. Went through a visioning, in terms of visioning, looking at the strengths of the competitor, what do they have that we like a lot, that we might want to bring in, or tenant improvement, obviously with visioning. Thinking about what do we do well, what's our market statement, and developing our brand. What is it we want to be? What does our building want to be about? Is this existing longer bumped-in building? Starting to reframe and think about rebranding, reinvesting. How do we build a new kind of vision for what we are as a building? In terms of making common sense, things like communicating to stakeholders, sharing knowledge, getting buy-in from people on our team as well as on the tenants, getting people in our building to know like this is what we're thinking about, and getting that, helping to make that real. We did a little bit on systems thinking, but what we found is that a lot of what we were doing going through this process was a lot of systems thinking overall. So marketing patterns, what's happening with people. That was a really great question kind of towards the end of what's happening with people in their environment, in their community right now that they would want to keep in the building, and how do we incorporate that if it's not already existing.
You did a great job.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Both groups did really well. That's terrific. All right, thank you. Now, our next breakout group is going to be a little bit different. We've learned over time in our Leadership Forum series that our participants really enjoy breaking down into really tiny groups, maybe 2 people. So we're going to ask you to pair off and work on some issues within your own company. And we're going to ask you to reframe the strategic leadership focus within your organization. Just think about aspects of the company that you work with. And how can you reframe some of these opportunity areas by asking questions such as those posted. They're not the only questions that you need to ask. You can take 1, you can take 2, but it will help you think about how you can apply the strategic thinking concepts to your own organization and to your own team. So we want to be able to pull that out, and then you'll be able to think this through with a colleague. You'll compare notes and talk about each of your situations. And then in your workbook, you've got an action plan that you can make your commitments to following up with your colleague on. And again, the feedback we get from the last number of sessions has been very positive, that people like that personal connection and that commitment to one another to pursue that development on their own. So we're going to ask you to pair off. Doesn't matter how you do it, but we'd prefer groups of 2 because we think you'll be more productive with 2 than with 3. But if you have a third, that's okay. It's not the end of the world.
Really quick. So on page 19 of your workbook, we have a strategic thinking action plan for you to look over, and it'd be great if you could take about 5 minutes just to fill that out. It's really looking at where you are right now, where you see yourself in a few years, and just really putting together that action plan. So just take 5 minutes.
And taking the commitments with your colleague, your partner.
Right. And it's page 19 of your workbook.
So what I'd like to do now, or what Eric and I feel is important to do, is maybe share some of the, if we could ask some of you to share some of your thoughts relative to this exercise. What worked for you? Was this beneficial? What did you learn through this exercise? If some of you could share your thoughts. And don't jump in all at once. Jerry, what did you learn through this?
I'm sorry, we were just
Okay.
making.
Not to call you out, that was not my intent. Jean,
One thing I thought about is we talked about who our clients were, really, because we have a lot of different clients. You know, we have, a case where Kara's on the leasing team and I'm in mortgage banking. We have sort of the obvious, which is tenants and or her, land, her company, and for me, it's owners of real estate. But there are other clients too. For me, it's lenders. It's also my bosses. It's a whole slew of, so what would we do differently if we listened to all of the different types of clients we have? One is just work less with tasks in mind and take take a little extra minute or two, as I have a note on my computer, to really think things through and to deliver what the clients are asking for, not necessarily what I think they want.
great. So you're reframing who you're talking to, really, in broadening your approach to talk not just to clients, but others as well. And then you're trying to take time to pause and think about the strategic thinking piece and not just strategic acting and the execution. Great. Olivia.
So we were talking a little bit about how my company works really hard at being a healthcare company rather than a healthcare real estate company first, so that we understand the healthcare provider as much as possible. And I think that the thing that we could improve on is really sharing of information, because we're all very individualistically trying to learn as much as we can about the industry by reading lots of articles and that sort of thing. And sometimes I will share an article with my team of 6, and 2 out of the 3 have already read it and have not shared it with anyone else. And so that's kind of the thing that I'm going to work on with my team.
Great. It's a great idea. Others. Amy.
Well, Tony and I coming at it from fairly different medium. So Tony's an architect, I'm a lawyer, managing partner. We thought through, with your help, what it means to actually listen, as we heard, and also tying that to what quality means to our clients. So listening to them and understanding. So Tony, it could be, is quality designing the building that wins the award? Or is quality designing the building that meets all the clients' objectives? And that ties into what I do. So, for me, is it a given client, price might be the most important driver. Or the most important driver might be absolutely minimizing risk after the closing. Those can be incompatible sometimes. And so what are we really hearing from our clients? Do they want the wow building? Do they want the greenest building? Do they want the most functional building? And everybody will say yes to all of those, but you have to really hear what they.
Right, and also too, we talked about, breaking down what they're saying is what we're hearing, because sometimes what they think they're saying is not necessarily what they think they're saying, and to maybe, have that breakdown to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that the goals are understood.
So you're creating a shared understanding.
Right.
Great.
Great, really.
Others. All these are rich, and I'm sure everybody can learn from each person's perspective. Helen.
Well, one of the things I'm seeing, since I really am creating a new business, is actually interviewing a lot of people to find out what they want, what would be actually service.
So you can fill a need.
So I can fill it, yeah. I mean, I have an idea of what I want to do, but, how can what I want to do fill their need?
Great. It's a perfect example. Any others?
Okay, you asked me in the beginning, we were.
Okay, thanks, Jerry.
In my group, we're reorganizing the group, not only in their functional,
the types of stuff they do, but also in the areas of responsibilities they have as far as who they support for teams. And there's a lot of nervousness. So we were talking about the various ways to try to communicate strategy, and also so they really understand what the vision is, but also allowing them to reach out to anybody. Maybe we work remote, so we can't have the water cooler or go out to lunch thing, but finding different ways to communicate, open up communication so people can share their concerns about how.
You can have lunch, you each buy your own lunch and do
We do that, but it just doesn't feel the same. So, but yeah, it's really opening up communications up and down.
So reframing how you communicate to one another. Perfect. Other thoughts? Has this been helpful?
Yes. Great.
Great. Well, hopefully you'll take some of these concepts back and apply them in your day-to-day roles and responsibilities at your companies, and frankly in every other aspect of your life. So what we want to conclude with, and just to recap, is to encourage you to demonstrate strategic leadership when you think, act, and influence in ways that really drive sustainable competitive advantage for your organization. So with these tools, you'll be able to increase your EQ certainly, but also your strategic thinking quotient to drive that advantage, both to your organization and for you personally, which is again one of our objectives here. So hopefully that will happen. And I would like to make sure that you think about these three bubbles, because today we've talked about thinking strategically. In September, we're going to talk about acting strategically and developing a strategic team, a team that can act together to drive a strategy for an organization. And lastly, in December, we'll talk about influencing strategically and doing so in a way that will develop your strategic confidence as opposed to strategic competence, which is what we've done today. So again, all three of these are important, and think of the three-legged stool. Think, act, and influence. Together, they're stronger. Individually, they're strong, but they don't function as effectively until they all come together and create the stability for that stool.
We'd also like to point out that Becoming a Strategic Leader, this is a great book. This was actually laid is the framework for our entire program. A lot of great information from this book that touches on the thinking, acting, influencing of an organization, building a strategic team. It's a great book. We highly recommend it.
And we're going to include that in the drawing. So we're going to give out one of those as well as the 2 Powers of Habit. We'll just have to give it to you by mail.
So, but yeah, that's our presentation. We're so happy you all were here, and we hope you enjoyed it and got a lot out of it as much as we did putting it together. So.
Definitely. Thank you for your active involvement. It makes for a richer, thank you. But your involvement makes for a much richer program, and that's critical.